Get 5 coffins ready.
Hey everyone, welcome to my guide for Hercules. Hercules is a classic displacement CC based warrior with incredibly high damage and extremely high impact combos, but hitting those combos can be rather tricky. Hercules is mostly seen as a soul laner, and he's actually really solid as a support as well. For builds, Hercules is kinda all over the place. He can go more damaging, bruiser, or just full on tank. It really depends on the role he's in and how harshly he can be locked down by the enemy team. Relics wise, Hercules absolutely needs Blink. Even back in the day, when the game was much simpler, Hercules has always needed Blink, especially in the late game. Second relic, well, sometimes Blink is relegated to your second relic, as you may want to spring for a teleport in a soul lane, since Hercules really suffers from behind and benefits heavily from ahead. And in the support role, well, it's really whatever your team needs. A Shell is the classic choice, with Horrific and Sunder as great lockdown relics for Hercules and his team to focus down those Herc has CC'd with his abilities. Speaking of abilities, let's get to them, starting with his wonderfully simple passive. Hercules gains power for every instance of god damage that hits him, this amount scaling up by 1 power every level, and stacks up to 3 times, so you can get up to 9 power at level 1 and 66 power at level 20. Absolutely nothing to sneeze at, but it doesn't change Herc's playstyle too drastically. He'd always want to be right in people's faces anyways after his main combo, and this passive just makes that playstyle more effective. For you as the Hercules player, just recognize when you're at max passive stacks and take into account how quickly your opponents will put these stacks onto you. Some gods will apply stacks over the course of their combo, where others with damage over time abilities will spring your passive almost instantly. And never ever forget how strong his passive makes Hercules' basic attacks. Pretty much any extended trade is going to go in Hercules' favor if he's able to keep himself in range to basic attack. One of the abilities which allows this is his first ability. Herc dashes forward quickly, but in a narrow AoE and not at a very long distance. All enemies in the AoE will be damaged, as well as pushed back, and stunned for up to 1.5 seconds, this duration scaling with levels. And when I say this ability deals damage, it deals damage. Easily one of the biggest single hits in all of the warrior class. Waves that are bunched up are easily one-shot throughout most of the game, as are large portions of Squishy's life bars for a similar amount of time throughout the game. And with the hefty power scaling to boot, this is what helps Hercules really make a crazy instantaneous impact with just one ability. But the CC portion is where there are a few caveats. The push into the stun is obviously completely devastating. If you get in blink range, you should be looking for a blink 180 push on any squishy you can, and it's something you'll need to practice with Herc. But this obviously isn't always an option, and that leads us neatly into hitting weird angles and just generally missing this ability. Obviously while laning, pushing the enemy towards their tower outside of when they're close enough to be killed by a couple of basic attacks, and you save them that way, it's totally acceptable since most of the time, you can just dash them along with a good chunk of the wave, give them a basic attack, and then walk away. But late game, dashing towards enemies and most importantly pushing enemies back into their own team is not a good idea. This leads us into using the ability as peel, which again can be tricky. You've really got to angle yourself well, as simply pushing on an enemy who's diving your team in any direction other than directly away typically doesn't help too much. Typically pushing them to the side of whoever they're diving on is the best thing you could do in most situations. So using the ability raw is almost exclusively used for your 180 pushes, during trades during the laning phase, and of course for chase down. Speaking of which, this ability isn't the best escape in the world, so if you yourself are being chased, don't try to get a look-see at your enemy after you've dashed, as you'll need every inch of ground you've covered to make escapes as Herc. And definitely be careful pushing the people who you're trying to get away from in front of you by accident when they try to body block you. I've done that one before. So okay, if you can't use the ability raw in most late game situations, how does it come into play? When it's teamed with your second ability, of course. Hercules damages in a rectangular AoE in front of him, this AoE increasing in length as the ability is cast. This duration may not seem like much in training mode, but in high intensity situations you're really going to feel it, especially considering that enemies at the final third of the ability will be flung directly in front of Hercules, and Herc is free to move around as they're being flung towards him. So this is Herc's main combo and what you'll need to master if you really want to do well as Herc. Of course, getting a range to hit Herc's 2 in fights will never happen on anyone other than a tank, so you'll not only need to master the 2-1 combo for laning, but also adding the difficulty of Blink 2-1 as well. You need to judge the range of your blink as well as your 2 at the same time, as well as of course still hitting the right angle with a bit of wiggle room widthwise in the AoE to make sure your opponents don't move out of the Pluck's range while you're casting it. It's hard, but luckily not complicated, and it's one of the reasons why movement speed is so good on Hercules, allowing you to easily get into the deeper pockets of the Pluck portion of your 2's AoE. This of course does bring up the issue of other counters as well. Good reactions from enemies can avoid the Pluck if you don't hit it smack dab in the middle of the AoE. And if you use it too close, they can simply walk towards you a bit to avoid the Pluck. So you need to be using your 2 all the time and in different ways to test what method will work best against your respective opponents. That said, if they're diving onto your teammates, the ability does work great as peel. But again, just like trying to pluck offensively, this requires really good spacing from you as the Hercules player as you're trying to peel. And of course, since you're trying to peel, this is something you'll need to do quickly as well. It's a good thing that minions don't really do anything like that. So as a result, Herc's 2-1 is easily one of the best clears in the solo lane. But as Herc's third ability doesn't deal any damage, you'll need to choose whether you want to completely obliterate the wave, or leave one ability for clear and another ability for trying to trade. Typically you want to use your 1 to clear, and then save your 2 for trades. When trading with the 2 alone, if your opponent just gets all in your face once your first ability is down to avoid the pluck on your 2, don't forget that the 2 at close range does nearly instant and respectable damage, and not to mention resets your basic attack chain. So basic attacking twice, then casting your 2 to reset the chain back is a great usage of this ability. So you need to practice that 2-1 combo as much as you possibly can, especially flicking as well as using blink with the pluck on the 2. But at the same time, don't exclusively stand at your 2's maximum range all day, because all that's going to do is have your opponents just stand back or jump onto you if you use your second ability at max range for risky plucks over and over and over again. Keep that solid trade potential when using this ability at close range in mind, especially when teamed with your third ability. Hercules heals himself and gains protections for 4 seconds, a percentage of all the damage taken within this 4 seconds being healed back to Hercules at the end of the 4-second window. This percentage starting at 30% of all damage taken, but going all the way up to a whopping 70% of all the damage taken at max ability rank. So yes, you really can walk through towers and phoenixes, and tank entire mage ults, only to have almost the entire damage returned to you as healing. In theory anyways. 2 big counters to this ability come to mind immediately though. Anti-heal and, well, not hitting Hercules when he pops this ability. First let's get the simpler one out of the way. Sometimes people will see you pop this ability and just stop whatever they're doing, especially if you've already spent your first and or second ability, which would of course help you close the gap and force them into a trade. Now this sucks if you're the Hercules player, but they can really only afford to do this in the laning phase and in certain matchups where their characters will easily allow this. So don't expect to see it too often while laning, but be prepared to take stock of it and slow down your 2-1 combos and start spreading out the usage of those abilities so that they can less easily get away from you once you pop this ability. One of the biggest reasons they do this is of course to make you waste this ability, which has a crazy 17-second cooldown, but it's also to play around the brawling mechanic, and unfortunately Hercules is one of the characters most negatively affected by this mechanic. A quick lowdown on the brawling mechanic is that all healing from abilities and lifesteal are reduced by a whopping 40%. This mechanic is lifted the instant you do damage or are damaged by an enemy god, but if no other sources of damage are given or applied for 3 seconds, the anti-heal is reapplied. So if you 3 and someone is ranged or has a quick escape so you can't apply any more damage to them, they're going bye-bye, and any healing that you may have received for that first second will be reduced by this 40% debuff. It's a tight timing for sure, but don't forget that if you use this preemptively to try and reduce incoming damage, that initial heal will be affected by their brawling debuff as well. So using your 3 on stray damage, like say a Vulcan ult, will give back a pretty meager heal. It's a tough system to work around, but it's nothing compared to straight up anti-heal from enemy gods and their teams, and their items. Here I've compiled a bunch of gods that you really need to be wary of as Hercules. While going into just one of them is fine, if you see 2 or more of these gods on an enemy team, maybe skip Hercules on that one. On top of base anti-heal from gods though, items are just as, if not more effective. Divine Rune and Brawler's Beatstick in particular are seeing an absurd amount of play right now, and it hurts to try and get a good heal off in fights as a result of this. But like the brawling mechanic, there's really not that much you could do. You just need to try and fight through it as much as you can. And if the anti-heal is too overwhelming, like when against an Opwash, Odin, or upgraded Cursed Ankh, it may just be best to relegate this ability to using it against objectives and structures while sieging. But still, catch the enemy with little or no anti-heal, splash on a Shield of Regrowth or Catechist Shield, and the enemy team quite literally will not be able to kill you. So it's an ability with a lot of flaws, but with an insane reward when all goes in Hercules' favor, a bit like his ultimate. Hercules becomes CC immune and throws a huge boulder, this boulder rolling and bouncing off walls after it has landed. Keep in mind that Hercules can throw this boulder over walls as well, and the ricocheting boulder can hit enemies more than once for absurd damage. So luckily, after the chess game that is Herc's core kit, his ultimate is a very simple big boom ability. It's the perfect follow-up after a successful 2-1 or just after those abilities alone. Not to mention with 100% power scaling, it works great if you fully stacked your passive, enhancing the idea of this being a big finishing move. Don't forget that it's not just a finishing move for your own kills though. Stragglers in the enemy's backline, at a quarter or less HP, can easily be killed by a swift chuck of the boulder, which remember, can only be blocked by walls. so unless they've got a Ymir or something who's in the exact right spot, this ability is going to hit. In the same vein then, you can simply use this ability to chunk a large group of enemy gods if they're in the choke point. Don't do this at the start of fights of course, but when the fight is nearing its middle stage and you see a bunch of enemies heavily grouped, it's not a bad idea to chuck this ability into them for a boatload of damage. The same idea can be applied to waves too though. Sometimes you just need to back as Hercules and you don't have the mana for, or just plain don't want to 2-1 the wave and then spend time basic attacking it down. So you can just ult it instead for an instantaneous massacre of all minions in a given wave. I definitely see some Hercules players overusing this tactic, but if you're in a bind and you really need to back for an item, or just to heal back up, this is a great way to quickly dispose of that wave and do so. The final note is never forget about that CC immunity. The CC immunity is literally instant, and it practically works as a makeshift purification beads in some situations, especially when being chased. Of course, you need decent knowledge of the gods that are chasing you to time it right, but time it correctly or bait out the CC and respond to this ability, and you can have a huge swing in the fight. Let's apply everything we've learned so far for some combos with Hercules. For really leveling, you want your 2 at level 1, your 1 at level 2, and you can skip leveling your 3 in favor of another level in tier 1, then at level 4 finally level your 3rd ability. From there you want to max your 1, your 2, then your 3, leveling the ult whenever you can. Hercules is a classic bully of SMITE. In a 1-on-1, you can almost never outtrade him if he hits all of his abilities and you lack built-in anti-heal, and even when you do have anti-heal, the heal on his 3rd ability is still tough to deal with. Then, after taking half your life bar with his 2 and a slew of basic attack cancels, he one-shots the wave he just grouped up by aggroing them, and then heals back a bunch of the damage you dealt to him. This is how Herc works in theory, and especially against players who haven't played against a lot of Hercules. In actuality, playing Hercules is a lot of adaptation to what the enemy is doing. If you can't pick fights with them since they can either outtrade you or avoid too much of your damage, you have to stick to full clearing waves. If they literally never walk into pull range and stand under their tower, you have to bide your time and freeze waves as well as clear jungle camps, and even rotate out of lane early to ensure yourself a lead. If they are constantly looking to fight you, you need to have the judgment to know whether or not going for a quick 1-2 basic attack short trade or going for a more extended trade will be more beneficial in a particular matchup. And with the later stages of the game requiring you to completely shift focus into being there almost solely for your CC rather than your damage, relying instead on strictly swift combos at the maximum extent of your range, and sometimes needing to preserve your abilities to peel for your teammates as well. Not to mention, the cherry on top of all this, needing to really master that 2-1 combo to perfection in all sorts of situations and in clutch moments to boot. So needless to say, Hercules is dead simple on paper, but will take a lot of real world game time to really get a feel for what to do in every scenario, as every god, but more importantly every player you face, will force you to play differently almost every time. That's all I have on Hercules for now. Thanks for watching.